25 languages die every single year. Let that sink in for a second. It's this relentless, quiet extinction of human voices happening right under our noses. Yet, in the face of all this linguistic mortality, there is an absolutely mind-bending contradiction. One language, officially declared dead centuries ago, is currently speaking through the mother tongues of over 1 billion people today. Welcome back to Learning with Pratik. If you're new here, I try to increase neuroplasticity by exploring a new topic every day. I do all the reading and researching, so you don't have to. Today, we're diving into a language with a totally paradoxical dual life cycle: Latin. It's a fascinating explainer of how trying to freeze a language in time actually killed it as a native tongue, while breaking literally all of its rules is exactly what made it immortal. Part 1. Forging the Golden Age, Codifying Classical Latin. To really understand this language, we've got to look at its origins and the vast timescale it lived across. We're starting our analysis by examining the birth of Latin, framing its historical codification as a profound intellectual tension between elite preservation and organic, everyday evolution. So the language actually began its journey as Old Latin around the 7th century BC. Back then, it was just a rough, evolving tongue of the early Romans. But as Rome expanded its power, well, its language needed to project real authority. By 75 BC, we enter the era of Classical Latin, which lasted right up until the 3rd century AD. Now, this was an era of intense codification. The elites wanted a polished, perfected instrument of statecraft and literature, which basically set the stage for late Latin onwards. You know, the term classical itself comes from the Latin word classicus, meaning the first class or a reliable witness. It was a concept first applied by the 2nd century Roman lawyer and language teacher Marcus Cornelius Fronto to describe authors who were, at least in his eyes, first class. So the absolutely crucial point here is that classical Latin wasn't just how everyone spoke on the street. It was an artificial, highly polished standard. It was this prescriptivist construct defining what good, authentic Latin was meant to be for the educated elite. But as we all know, perfection has a price. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who ruled over the last generation of these classicists, pointed out that the foremost characteristic of this elite Latin was, in his words, unreality, arising from the extinction of freedom. He noticed how this declamatory tone arose. It was full of frigid, hysterical exaggeration, basically trying to make up for a complete lack of contact with daily affairs. This artificial rhetoric left late classical Latin feeling entirely divorced from reality. Part 2. The streets speak vulgar. Everyday descriptivism. Now, while the elites were busy polishing their rhetoric, something entirely different was happening outside the Senate doors. The ordinary Roman citizens were out there speaking a chaotic, rule-breaking dialect known as vulgar Latin. In natural, everyday speech, words are spoken fast. The heavy stress placed on the first syllable of a word caused the short vowels right in the middle, the open medial syllables, to literally weaken and disappear. This qualitative change is a beautiful example of human efficiency in language, driven purely by the natural rhythm of speech. This organic shift eventually built into a strict linguistic rule known as Axon's law of syncope, where medial sounds are entirely omitted just for the sake of speed. Take a look at the rigid classical word for hot, calidus. Compare that to its collapsed vulgar counterpart, caldus. See how that short medial vowel it was aggressively deleted? The ordinary Roman didn't care about the first-class rules of Fronto. They just wanted to get their point across as efficiently as possible. And it wasn't just pronunciation that shifted either. The entire grammar was simplified from the ground up. Vulgar Latin saw the loss of complex oblique noun cases. Those are the intricate word endings used to show grammatical function, and replaced them with a wider, much simpler use of prepositions. The neutered gender completely vanished too, and we start to see the early rise of Romans' articles. So what were considered errors by classical standards were actually organic simplifications. They laid the exact groundwork for modern Romance languages. Part 3. Frozen in medieval amber, fossilized Latin. When the Roman Empire eventually fell, Europe entered the Middle Ages, which created this incredibly sharp linguistic divide. On one hand, you had medieval Latin. It possessed immense prestige, antiquity, and stability, yet it had incredibly low daily utility for the average person. It was basically strictly used to draft legal documents or express high-level theoretical ideas in theology. On the other hand, you had these emerging vernacular tongues. Now, they had low status, sure, but remarkably high utility for daily life. The high status of Latin and the low status of the vernacular basically went hand in hand, constantly reinforcing each other. The defining difference between the two is really how they were learned. Medieval Latin was sustained purely by the artificial authority of rigid grammar books. Conversely, the vernaculars were native languages. They were acquired naturally, by ear and imitation, right from childhood. Because, as we know, children naturally generalize and generate complex expressions. Medieval Latin had entirely lost this organic spark. It was just kept alive by institutions, completely separated from the natural way we humans actually acquire language. Part 4. The Humanist Revival, Resuscitating the Past. But history wasn't done with Latin just yet. As Europe transitioned into the Renaissance, we see this almost desperate intellectual resuscitation, where scholars looked backward to the classical past, hoping to move humanity forward. This revival was driven by the concept of studia humanitatis, coined originally by the Roman statesman Cicero and revived centuries later by the Florentine scholar Petrarch. It refers to studies focusing on what it truly means to be human. Petrarch and his fellow humanists rejected the grim, dogmatic scholasticism of the Middle Ages. Instead, they scoured obscure monastic libraries to discover lost ancient manuscripts, seeking to cultivate real civic virtue through the wisdom of antiquity. These humanists absolutely revered Latin. They focused heavily on eloquent rhetoric and Latin grammar, not just as some dry academic exercise, but as essential tools for public persuasion. They genuinely believed that studying the eloquence of Cicero was a way to build civic virtue, critical analysis, and objective observation. They wanted to resurrect that old classicist standard to build a better, more intellectually free society. Part 5. The Immortal Language, Resolution of a Paradox. So, how did the elites attempt to freeze Latin end up killing it, while the vulgar corruption of the streets managed to immortalize it? Well, before we answer that, let's look at a pretty chilling statistic: 2,500. According to linguistic researchers, there are roughly 5,000 living languages today. But by the end of this century, it's estimated that only 2,500 will remain. Half of the world's languages will just vanish. That really underscores the extreme fragility of human communication. Languages are the providers of life. When they die, a massive part of humanity's cognitive structure dies right along with them. But the story of Latin offers a fascinating counterpoint to all of this linguistic death. The elite's attempt to freeze Latin perfectly in amber is exactly what killed it as a daily spoken language, yet the vulgar, chaotic, rule-breaking corruption of the streets, the very thing those purists absolutely hated, is what actually allowed it to survive and evolve into French, Spanish, Italian, and more. Which leaves us with this final thought. Is a language ever truly dead if it birthed the tongues of a billion people? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, especially if you have something particular in mind. Thanks for watching. Tomorrow, we open a different page. Until then, Pratik, out.